I first hired her on a whim. My neighbor had mentioned her during one of our usual morning chats over the fence. Young, efficient, trustworthy. I hadn't been looking for anyone in particular, but something about the idea of letting someone else handle the mess appealed to me. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe it was something deeper, a need for change, for disruption, even if I didn't recognize it at the time. When she rang the doorbell that first Friday morning, I was still in my robe, hair tied back lazily, coffee cup in hand. She stood there, sunlight behind her, and for a moment I was struck not by her youth, but by her presence. Not loud or flamboyant, just steady, intentional. She walked through the house with practiced ease as I pointed out what needed attention. I watched her eyes scan the corners, her hands tracing over surfaces as if memorizing them. She didn't speak much, just nodded occasionally, and I remember thinking how composed she seemed for someone so young. After a short tour, I left her alone to work. I had errands to run, and besides, I didn't want to hover. Still, as I drove away, I caught myself wondering what she'd notice about the house. Would she see the faint fingerprints on the glass doors? The half-finished book left on the armrest? The blanket tossed across the sofa that I always meant to fold? I imagined her noticing the details, touching the things I touched, walking through the spaces I'd inhabited alone for so long. That evening, I returned to a quiet, transformed home. It wasn't just clean, it felt reordered, subtly different, like someone had breathed new life into the rooms. The kitchen gleamed in a way it hadn't in years, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and something else I couldn't place. There was no trace of her left behind, no note, no sign, only the result of her hands, her presence folded into the walls. I was surprised by the way it affected me. Not gratitude exactly, but something closer to curiosity. I found myself imagining her moving through the rooms, how she must have looked bent over the tub or reaching high for the top shelf. I told myself it was silly, that I was just appreciating good work, but even then, I knew it was more than that. The next Friday, I stayed home. I had no reason to, but I did. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop, pretending to work while listening to the rhythm of her movements. She worked with a kind of focused calm that made it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Occasionally, I would glance up and catch a glimpse of her through a doorway, kneeling beside the baseboards, stretching to dust a high shelf. There was something hypnotic about the way she moved. Her steps were light, her motions precise, and I realized I was watching her more than I was working. I chastised myself quietly and returned my attention to the screen, but the awareness of her lingered like static just under the skin. Week after week she returned, and with each visit, something settled into place. I started anticipating her arrival, planning my mornings around her presence. The house began to feel different on the day she came, more awake, more alive. I started leaving little things out without meaning to. A scarf draped across a chair, a favorite mug left unwashed in the sink, a half-read letter folded on the table. It wasn't intentional, not really, but I noticed when she picked them up, straightened them, placed them just so. I noticed her noticing me. Not overtly, not obviously, but there was a sense of being seen, as though I'd stepped into a light I hadn't realized I'd missed. There was nothing inappropriate, nothing that crossed a line. She was polite, efficient, always professional. But there was something in the air during those mornings, a slowness, a tension that hummed low and quiet, like a melody beneath the noise of the vacuum cleaner or the gentle clatter of dishes. I began to linger in the room she cleaned, pretending to read, to sip tea, to sort papers, just to be near, just to feel whatever it was that stirred when she was close. I didn't understand it yet. I wasn't even sure it was real. But every Friday when she stepped through the door, something inside me shifted, small, imperceptible, but undeniable, like a habit forming without permission. a new rhythm entering my life, soft and steady, a presence that made me feel strangely awake. And even though I couldn't name it, I didn't want it to stop. It began to seep into me in ways I hadn't anticipated. At first, it was fleeting, just a glance that lingered too long, a shift in the air when she passed behind me, a moment of stillness where something unspoken hovered. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was all in my head, but the feeling persisted. It settled into my skin like warmth from the sun, slow and quiet, but impossible to ignore. Every time she entered the house, something inside me stirred. Not loudly, not urgently, just a subtle pull, like the first hint of a tide drawing back. She had a way of moving through the rooms that made it impossible not to watch. The way her hands smoothed out linens, the way her body bent to reach beneath furniture, the way her sleeves fell back when she rinsed a cloth beneath the faucet. I found myself waiting for these moments, seeking them, without acknowledging that I was doing so. My eyes followed her unconsciously, cataloging the lines of her body, the curve of her neck, the shadows along her collarbone. I began to remember the way she looked, even after she left, carrying her image with me like an imprint. The more I noticed, the more I wanted to. Her hair would fall from its tie as she worked, loose strands brushing her cheeks, and I'd feel a strange heat rise in my chest. When she leaned over to clean the floor, the hem of her shirt would lift just enough to reveal a sliver of skin, and my breath would hitch without warning. I told myself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything, but something deep inside me whispered otherwise. Something old, something hidden, something I had learned long ago to keep buried. She never acted inappropriately. There was no suggestion, no breach of etiquette, and yet I felt watched, not in a way that unsettled me, but in a way that made my skin tingle with awareness. When I entered a room, I sometimes caught her gaze on me, and she wouldn't look away immediately. She would hold it, just long enough to make my heart pick up its pace. I began to dress more carefully on Fridays, not drastically, but enough. A softer blouse, a lighter scent, lipstick that I didn't really need. I told myself it was out of habit or because I was going out later, but that was a lie I no longer believed. I began to feel her presence even when she wasn't near. I would hear the vacuum start in the next room and find myself distracted, imagining the shape of her back as she moved across the carpet. I would pass the bathroom and picture her wiping the mirror. Her reflection paused for a moment as if seeing something she couldn't explain. The house became filled with echoes of her touch, her scent, the sound of her breath when she worked quietly near me. I didn't know how to name what was happening. It wasn't obsession, not yet, but it was something close. My body began to betray me. When she brushed past me on the way to fetch supplies, my skin would hum where hers had passed. A casual touch, a hand steadying herself on the edge of a table where I sat, would send a ripple through me so intense I'd have to close my eyes. I began to crave those brief, accidental connections, the moments where she stood just a little too close, where our arms nearly touched as she leaned past me, where I could feel the heat of her body without contact. It became a kind of hunger, slow and patient, but growing. And underneath it all, there was shame, a quiet shame that curled itself around the desire, wrapping it in questions I wasn't ready to answer. I told myself I was being foolish, that I was too old for this, that it wasn't real, but I couldn't stop the way I felt. It wasn't just physical, it was deeper, stranger. It was the way I felt seen when she looked at me, the way I felt known, as if she had somehow slipped beneath the surface of who I pretended to be and found something buried, something I had stopped trying to understand years ago. She didn't flirt. She didn't tease. But she was aware. I knew it. I felt it in the way she moved through my space, in the way her fingers slowed when she touched my things, in the way her eyes followed me sometimes, steady and unreadable. I started to wonder what she thought of me, not just as a client, but as a woman. If she noticed the tension that built when we shared a room, if she felt it too, and if she did, what it meant. And if she did, what it meant. I became more careful with her, and also less so. I stopped pretending I wasn't affected. I let myself feel the charge between us, even if I didn't act on it. I leaned into the ambiguity, into the strange thrill of not knowing what would happen next. Every Friday when she walked through my door, my pulse quickened. My body remembered her before my mind could form a single thought. I had never lived like this, with such sharp awareness of another person's presence, with such constant ache beneath my skin. But there it was, real, palpable, undeniable, a sensation I could no longer push away. Something had shifted, and I could feel it, not just in my thoughts, but under my skin. It happened slowly, without drama or declaration, as if our bodies had been moving toward it all along. The shift wasn't loud. It was quiet, precise, like a thread slipping from a needle or the way light changes just before dusk. That morning had started like any other. She arrived on time, as usual, and moved through the house with her quiet confidence. I stayed in the bedroom longer than I needed to, pretending to scroll through emails, pretending I didn't feel the awareness crawling along my spine as she moved around the space. She knelt near the bed, wiping the floor with long, deliberate strokes. Her shirt slid up slightly each time she reached forward, revealing a ribbon of warm skin that made my stomach tighten. I could hear her breathing, slow and measured, and feel the tension in my shoulders building with every quiet second. I sat on the edge of the bed, legs crossed, pretending to be absorbed in the soft glow of my laptop screen, but I wasn't reading. I was watching her from the corners of my eyes, counting the inches between us and wondering what it would feel like if that distance closed. At one point, she stood up, brushing her hands off on the front of her jeans, and walked past me to the dresser. The air shifted as she moved by, warm and charged, and when she turned slightly, her hip grazed my knee. It was so brief, so light, but I felt it everywhere. A jolt, not of shock, but of recognition. My breath caught. I didn't move. Neither did she. Not right away. There was a stillness between us then, like the pause between two notes in a song that's about to change key. She stayed close, too close, but didn't step away. My skin began to prickle with awareness. Every part of me tuned itself to her presence, the scent of her hair, the way her arm hovered beside mine, the hum of her breath. She didn't touch me again. She didn't have to. The absence of touch became its own kind of intimacy. The tension thickened, stretched like silk pulled taut, and I was afraid to speak or shift, afraid I might break whatever fragile current was holding us in place. Eventually, she moved on, her body brushing lightly past mine once more as she reached for the window. I exhaled slowly when she turned her back. My hands were shaking. My chest felt tight. I stared down at my knees and realized I'd been holding them rigid, unmoving, waiting. I didn't know for what. A word? A confession? A spark? But no sound came. Only the familiar rhythm of her work resuming, as if nothing had happened. Later, when I walked into the kitchen, she was already there, wiping down the counters. The late morning sun slanted across the tiles, making everything feel too bright, too exposed. I opened a cabinet, searching for something I didn't need, just to be near her again. She stepped aside without a word, but as I passed behind her, the backs of our hands touched. Not a full touch, not even a grasp, just the soft collision of skin on skin, a brush, a breath. But I felt it bloom through me like heat. I paused, unsure if it was real, unsure if I had imagined it. But then I looked up, and she was already looking at me. Her gaze wasn't daring or shy. It was still, knowing. There was no smile, no raised eyebrow, just a presence, a steadiness that made me feel like I had been seen in a way I hadn't allowed in years. I turned away quickly, ashamed of the flush rising to my cheeks, but the imprint of her fingers against mine lingered like a secret I hadn't meant to tell. That day, the smallest moments began to carry unbearable weight. Her hand brushing against the back of a chair as I stood too close, the soft knock of her knee against mine when we both reached for the same item, the ghost of her scent when she passed me in the hall. I started memorizing the texture of every near contact, the warmth of it, the ache that followed. And through it all, I pretended. I played the part I was used to, calm, composed, professional. But inside, I was unraveling, slowly, quietly, deliberately. Not from something broken, but from something waking. My body, my mind, my breath, they all knew before I did that a boundary had been touched. Not crossed, not yet, but tested, and the skin beneath it remembered. It was one of those days that felt suspended in air, as if time had slowed just enough for everything to take on a different texture. The light filtering through the curtains was softer, more diffused, and the house held a quiet that wasn't empty, but expectant. I stayed home again, not out of necessity, but because I couldn't imagine being anywhere else while she was here. I moved through the morning with deliberate slowness, each motion quiet and careful, as if trying not to disturb something delicate and unseen. She arrived like always, punctual and calm, but her presence felt different that day. Not forced, not louder, but fuller somehow. She moved with the same grace, the same quiet rhythm, but something in the air between us had shifted, no longer filled with possibility, but with certainty. I watched her without hiding it. I didn't pretend to work or busy myself with distractions. I simply let her exist in front of me, and I let myself be present for it. Every step she took across the wooden floor echoed just a little louder than usual. Every glance she gave me lingered just a second longer. She spent most of her time in my bedroom that morning. I followed without meaning to. I stood in the doorway, watched as she folded clean linens, her hands moving over the fabric with practiced ease. The muscles in her arms flexed under the weight of the duvet. Her body moved like she wasn't aware of being watched, and maybe she wasn't. Or maybe she was, and she was letting me look. The sunlight caught in her hair, in the smooth curve of her cheek, and I found myself staring at her back, at the small rise and fall of her breath as she smoothed the bedspread with both palms. I sat on the edge of the bed, not out of fatigue, but out of need to be near her. My hands rested in my lap, but I could feel the tension in them, the awareness of her every movement. She turned and caught my eyes, and for the first time I didn't look away. The air between us stilled. Something passed through the silence. Permission, perhaps, or simply understanding. She walked past me to reach the mirror, and her hip brushed mine, light but deliberate. She didn't apologize. I didn't flinch. I just breathed her in. When she reached up to clean the mirror, her shirt lifted slightly, revealing the smooth stretch of her lower back. My gaze followed the shape of her spine, the way her body moved with such ease, and my thoughts blurred into heat. I stood and stepped closer than I should have. I wasn't thinking anymore. I wasn't pretending. My hand hovered just behind her, not touching, just feeling the warmth that radiated from her skin. She turned slightly, sensing me, but didn't move away. We stood there in the narrow space between the bed and the dresser, the mirror fogged slightly from her breath, and the silence between us heavy with anticipation. She reached for a cloth on the dresser, and her fingers brushed mine. Not a mistake, not an accident. The contact was intentional, tender, measured. My breath caught in my throat as her fingers lingered, warm and light against mine. I felt my hand turn, almost of its own accord, and meet hers fully. We stood like that for what felt like forever, hands barely touching, bodies too close, eyes locked not in surprise, but in quiet recognition. It didn't feel like a first step. It felt like something we had both been walking toward without ever speaking of it. Then she let go, gently. Her hand slipped away, and she returned to her work, but everything had changed. I remained still, watching her, my skin still tingling from the contact. I sat back down, legs trembling slightly, my heart loud in my chest. My thoughts weren't loud. They were quiet, simple, wordless. They pulsed through me like a rhythm I had always known but never danced to. Her presence filled the room in a way it never had before, not as a guest, not as an employee, but as something else entirely. When she passed me again later, carrying clean towels, her shoulder brushed mine. I didn't move. I felt the heat of her skin through the thin fabric of both our sleeves, and it burned like a promise. There was no apology, no nervousness, just the growing awareness that what we had been pretending not to feel was now undeniable. We had crossed into a space where nothing was accidental anymore. That afternoon, when she finished and quietly gathered her things to leave, our eyes met one last time by the front door. It wasn't a goodbye. It wasn't even a pause. It was a continuation, a silent agreement that we were no longer playing a game of boundaries. The line had blurred, and we both knew we wouldn't step back. I woke in the middle of the night, not startled, not anxious, just aware. A soft hum lived in my skin, quiet but insistent, as if my body had remembered something before my mind did. The sheets were warm and tangled around my legs, the air still heavy with the scent of her, faint lavender, a trace of sweat, something uniquely hers. My heart beat slowly but with weight, each pulse echoing with everything we hadn't said but had already done. The house was silent, but my body wasn't. It was alert in a way that felt new and old all at once. My fingertips tingled, my mouth dry from sleep and memory. I didn't open my eyes right away. I lay still, letting the night hold me, the room around me stretching wide and close all at once. My skin felt marked, not visibly, but intimately. The place on my wrist where her hand had rested hours earlier throbbed with a phantom warmth. My neck tingled with the memory of her breath. My thighs, slightly parted beneath the sheets, felt heavy, aware, still swollen with the echo of her mouth. I turned slowly onto my side, the fabric dragging over my bare skin, and the sensation was enough to make me inhale sharply. It wasn't pain. It was aftermath. It was proof. My body had been touched, held, seen. Every inch of me had been acknowledged in ways I hadn't allowed in years. She had moved over me not like a visitor, but like someone returning to familiar ground, someone who knew where to press, where to pause, where to wait for my breath to catch before continuing. I had followed her rhythm without resistance, had opened myself not just in gesture, but in truth. The sheets clung to my skin as I sat up slowly, my body still humming. My thighs bore the faint soreness of being spread and held. My breasts still tingled from her mouth, and my stomach clenched when I shifted and felt the slight ache between my legs. She had left no marks that anyone else would see, but my body was no longer mine in the way it had been before. It carried her now, in memory, in scent, in sensation. I stood and walked quietly through the house, each step deliberate, grounded by the lingering weight of her hands. The floor was cool against my feet, grounding me as I passed through the living room, the kitchen, the hallway. Everywhere I moved, I saw her. I saw her bent over the arm of the couch, wiping down the table, standing in the kitchen pouring water, her eyes following me when she thought I wasn't looking. I saw the flash of her teat when she smiled, the heat in her eyes when our bodies finally met. She had woven herself into the fabric of this house, and now into me. In the bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. My hair was tangled, my lips a little swollen, my collarbones still flushed with color. I ran a hand down my side, over the curve of my hip, and paused when my fingers reached the place where her palm had rested. My skin remembered. It pulsed beneath my touch, as if urging me to recall the exact moment when her weight had pressed me into the mattress and made me feel entirely present. I hadn't realized how numb I had become until her touch burned that away. Back in the bedroom, I slipped under the sheets again and curled onto my side. My body was tender, but it wasn't weakness, it was awakening. I drew my knees up, my arm draped across my ribs, and closed my eyes. Images bloomed behind my eyelids, her mouth moving down my stomach, her breath on the inside of my thigh, her voice, low and urgent, against my skin. My hips shifted involuntarily at the memory. I let it wash over me. I let it stay. Sleep returned slowly, like a tide coming back to shore. But even as I drifted, I felt her inside me. Not in the way lovers leave a trace, but in the way memory embeds itself in muscle, in breath, in the private spaces of the body that don't forget. I would never be able to lay in this bed again without remembering how she moved in it, how she looked at me in the dark, how I gave in. Not because I was weak, but because I wanted to be touched where I was most hidden. And now I was, and my body would never forget it. The silence of the house the next morning was unlike anything I'd known. It wasn't empty, and it wasn't cold. It was full, saturated with everything that had happened, quiet but dense with meaning. The light coming through the window was soft and low, slipping between the blinds like it was trying not to intrude. I lay still, the sheets around me barely moved, the space beside me cool but not vacant. She had gone, sometime before dawn, leaving behind nothing but the imprint of her body and the echo of her breath against my skin. I didn't rush to move. My limbs were heavy in the way they only are after surrender, after something real. Every part of me felt altered, not bruised, not marked, but deeply shifted. My chest held a strange ache, not from pain, but from fullness, from the overwhelming weight of being touched where I thought I had long since gone quiet. The scent of her still lingered in the room, soft and unwashed, tucked into the fabric of the pillowcase and the bend of my arm. I breathed it in and felt something settle inside me, something I didn't want to name for fear of making it too real, too fragile. Eventually, I stood. I moved slowly, almost reverently, as though the room had become sacred. The bed remained unmade, and I left it that way. I padded through the house barefoot, the floor cool beneath my feet, the air tasting of sleep and heat and something like electricity. Her presence was everywhere, not in objects or clutter, but in the way the space felt, warmer, stiller, paused. The kitchen was tidy, the counters wiped clean, as if nothing had happened, but I felt her at the stove. I saw her hands on the mug she used. I heard her quiet humming, even though it wasn't there. When I reached for my own cup, I found myself pausing, fingers curling around the ceramic like it meant something. And maybe it did. Everything felt changed, not in some grand cinematic way, but in the way a room feels different after someone leaves who once looked at you like they saw more than what you showed. I stood by the window with the cup in my hands, watching the breeze press against the glass. I wasn't thinking of the future. I wasn't even thinking of the night. I was just standing inside the moment that came after. I walked past the mirror and caught my reflection without meaning to. My skin still carried the glow of being wanted. There was a softness in my shoulders I hadn't seen before, something less guarded in my eyes. It startled me. Not the image itself, but the realization of how long it had been since I had looked at myself and seen someone that wasn't pretending. I touched my collarbone lightly, felt the memory of her lips there, and closed my eyes. My pulse responded with a flicker of warmth. I let it rise and fall. The day unfolded with no expectations. I didn't need to assign meaning. I didn't reach for certainty. I moved through each room slowly, not searching for her, but feeling her anyway. I opened the windows, I ran water in the sink, I stepped into the hallway and stood still for a long time with my hand on the doorknob to my bedroom. I didn't know what would happen next, and for the first time, I didn't need to. Something had been answered inside me, and now I carried that answer in my breath, in the stretch of my spine, in the tremble that came not from fear, but from having been opened. It wasn't just about the night. It was about what had been waiting underneath everything for longer than I wanted to admit. It had taken only one night to cross into it, but the weight of that shift would last far beyond. Not just in my body, but in the way I walked through the world. I wasn't watching the clock. I wasn't waiting for the next Friday. I was inside something that had already begun and couldn't be undone. Not a secret, not a mistake, just a truth, quiet and unshakable, planted now in the center of who I was.